Hey guys, welcome back to the third week of our college football rankings. After last week, we had some big, exciting games. We'll talk about a lot of those teams that have moved up. There's also a lot of teams that have moved out of our rankings. But let's just start off with the 25 area. We're going to have a bunch of new teams on both of our lists just because some teams fell off a little bit. Starting off with my 25th spot, I have UCLA. They were unranked last week, and a lot of teams fell off a little bit. UCLA was unranked for me. They were ranked by the committee, I believe, at 24, but they come onto my list here after an impressive win against San Diego State. Dante Moore, 3 touchdowns, 300 yards, and overall, good rushing attack, too. They took my 25th spot.
Yeah, and in my 25 spot, I have Arkansas. I'm just starting to buy in on the Jefferson hype a little bit more. But to be honest, this could be a short-term stay. They have LSU, Texas A&M, and Ole Miss all coming up soon. Obviously, SEC schedules, it could be tough. But I really liked what I've seen from Arkansas. I wanted to give them a little bit of credit here. Them and a team like UCLA are really close for me, but I'm a little more on the side of Arkansas. So they're at my 25 spot.
In my 24 spot, I have Clemson. This week, Cade Klubnik had a big comeback game, 315 yards and 4 touchdowns. I had them on my list last week, even after that loss. And I'm going to continue to leave them on the list this week, especially after a big win like that. They're struggling a little bit to start the game, but they end up winning by almost 50 points. So I believe they should be on here.
Yeah, for sure. And Clemson's a team that fell off my list, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him come back pretty soon, especially if Klubnik continues to play at a higher level like I expected him to. At 24, I have Washington State. If I can be honest, I'm not completely bought into the hype, but they got a win over a Wisconsin team that I had ranked at 19 last week. That and, them winning their first game gives them a spot on my list here. So for now, the Cougars definitely belong. They have some tests coming forward, and we'll see how they do.
Yeah, next up, Miami. I have them at 23. They beat Texas A&M pretty handily. Tyler Van Dyke, who was kind of an underdog dark horse for a lot of people in the Heisman race this year, came out and proved why. 370 yards, 5 touchdowns. Also, Jacoby George, 94 yards and 3 touchdowns in the air. 2 interceptions and a kick return for a touchdown from this defense. Overall, the team just routed Texas A&M, who I had ranked last week. And they're coming into the rankings now, and they're going to be in some tough competition in that whole conference this year. There's going to be some good games, so I'm excited to see those play out.
Yeah. 23, I have Iowa. Iowa was a team I haven't had ranked so far, but they went into Iowa State and won the game, and they ran the ball a ton. Basically, what I've been seeing the story of this team is it's the defense and it's the pacing. They play a slow style of football as they always do. Their defense is clutch, but Cade McNamara isn't doing a whole lot on the offensive side. And honestly, that's fine. For an Iowa team, they don't need to have an electric offense. If Cade McNamara can just be, stand around in the pocket, just manage the offense, be a game manager in that way, I think this Hawkeyes team is going to continue to be pretty good. I see them winning a couple more games going forward. Obviously, Big Ten can get tough sometimes, so who knows if fall off is on the way. But I do like them as a team that I feel like I need to give a little bit of credit to at this point in the season.
And at 22, I have Washington State. I have them a little higher than you, just because I had Wisconsin ranked pretty high last week. I had them at 18, and they go in there, and Washington State beats them. Cameron Ward continues to play well. He's going to be a very good player this year overall, and he's putting his name into the ring there with a great game. And I think Washington State is going to look pretty good for the rest of the season.
Yeah, and I could definitely see that happening. At 22, I have Miami just a spot higher than you did. Van Dyke, as you mentioned, is trying to get another Heisman campaign. He didn't catch all the steam he wanted to last year. Hopefully 2023 can be the season where he does that because he looked great against A&M, who I also had ranked. 375, 5 touchdowns, just an incredible game. And I feel for A&M fans because Connor Wegman, after having a really good week 1, kind of played the Aggies out of this one. It was pretty disappointing. So A&M's another team that could slide back up soon. But for now, the Hurricanes are on a roll. And college football is good when Miami's good. So I'm excited to see it. And hopefully Van Dyke can keep pushing this season. It would be really cool to get him in that top 5 Heisman rankings that we put out weekly on the Instagram.
Next up in the 21 and 20 spot, we both have UNC and Duke. We just have them flipped. I have Duke in the 21 and UNC in the 20. Duke, I had moving up this week, Riley Leonard, 12 for 12, 136 yards and a touchdown. But Jordan Waters, 112 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. They ran the ball very well this week, and they're continuing to look good. Riley Leonard, like I said last week, really playing into that role of Daniel Jones. I mean, when he goes out there and plays, you can tell has a lot of shorter mid-level passes, but he can run the ball when he needs to, and that's working out for them very well. UNC, Drake May with 1 rushing touchdown. That was it. He didn't have any passing touchdowns, but Omarion Hampton had 230 yards and 3 touchdowns, which is enough to win a game by itself. They beat Appalachian State in double overtime, and usually if they beat a team like that, I have them dropping only a spot here. I know you have them dropping a little more, but I mean, Appalachian State seems to be competitive against any ranked competition whenever they play, but UNC didn't look the best, and Drake May didn't look the best overall with no touchdowns. But that running game was good enough to keep them still at least a little bit afloat here.
Yeah, and I completely understand what you're saying. For me, I have UNC and Duke flip-flopped, honestly, just because Duke looks better. So far into the season, I don't think it would be a stretch to say Riley Leonard is outplaying Drake May, and that is not something I expected to say, especially because I consider Drake May one of the best college football quarterbacks just nationwide. The game from UNC was not impressive to me at all. I think they bounced back from that. But if we're just talking about which team in the ACC looks better right now, I have to say Duke plays the part a little more. I have a little more confidence in them. Leonard didn't have, an incredible statistical passing game last week or anything, but he went 12 for 12 before getting pulled. Absolutely, ran through Lafayette. And UNC struggled against App State. As you mentioned, App State has a history for playing up against their competition. But at the same time, if UNC is going to be a team I have ranked weekly, they need to go out and win those games and, provide me a little more confidence. So both these teams in a similar spot, but I would be lying if I said I didn't think Duke looks a little bit better right now.
Next up, the next few teams that we have, 19 through 16, we have the same rankings. Starting off with Colorado, I have them moving up 4 spots this week. Shedeur Sanders made all the plays he needed to. They looked a little slow in the first half, but the offense definitely started clicking in the second half. 400 yards, 3 total touchdowns, and Xavier Weaver, 170 yards and a touchdown, is looking to become that #1 receiver, especially with a lot of good players out there. I mean, this Colorado team is probably the most exciting in college football right now. The difference between college football and the NFL is sometimes we see NFL teams rise up a little bit, but historically, I mean, a lot of teams have been good at least some point. In college football, Colorado was decent a long time ago, but now they're starting to come back, and it's always good to see teams come back like that. They have a matchup against Colorado State next week before they go into that gauntlet that we've talked about the past few weeks. So a good win this week, and they got to prep next week before they go into those games against Oregon and USC.
Yeah, I think a lot of people last week were scared to have the Buffaloes ranked any higher than like that 25 area, because who knows, this Nebraska team is built up pretty well. Obviously, they have good coaching. They have a really solid defense, but with Colorado going in and just having another incredible game, it only feels right to have them bumped up a couple spots. Obviously, I have them at 19 as well. And, I wouldn't say the Nebraska offense is ever going to be incredibly impressive in the state that it is in now. But seeing Colorado completely shut down the passing game and provide a lot of pass rush pressure was really, it was something great to see. Whether you attribute the pass defense to a guy like Travis Hunter, or you think it's more of the rush or the safety, whatever you call it, that Colorado team has it figured out right now. And going into the gauntlet, as you mentioned, this is the type of game that is going to look really good on their resume. I think 19 is even a little low. I'd understand if people have them ranked higher than we do, but the Buffs look good right now. I'm really excited to see how the rest of their season goes.
Next up, we both have Oregon State at 18. We both have them dropping 1 spot. DJ Uiagalelei, only 107 yards, only 13 passes overall and 2 touchdowns, but the run game overall, 270 total yards and 3 touchdowns. They won the game, but as we'll talk about in a little bit, we have Ole Miss above them. That's why both of these teams, Oregon State and Oklahoma, moved down. Just not overall that impressive from both of those schools, especially after that Ole Miss win.
Yeah, for sure. And Oregon State didn't really do anything wrong. They got a lot of dudes involved, and they smoked a really bad team. I really just want to mention Damian Martinez, the running back. He looked really good week 1. He looked even better last week. So he's a guy I really want to keep my eye out for. He might be one of my guys going forward because he's just a really solid player. And I'm really happy to see him get involved early. So Oregon State moves down, but I thought it was a good game overall. Can't complain.
Yeah, and the same thing that we saw from Oklahoma. A win over SMU. Not that exciting overall from the game. Dylan Gabriel, though, 4 touchdowns, but only 176 yards in the air. Tawee Walker with 120 yards rushing. Same thing as Oregon State, just not that impressive.
Yeah, and for Oklahoma, I was impressed with their defense at least a little bit. SMU is a really pass-heavy team. I know they're not up to the same level as a squad like Oklahoma, but even these, pass-heavy squads that are a little bit worse talent-wise, once they go pass-heavy, it's easier for them to get points up on the board in bunches. And they really didn't allow a whole lot. 11 points is not a super high margin, so I think their defense deserves credit. But as you mentioned, it's not really a game that swung me one way or the other.
Yeah, and speaking of a team, like we talked about before, Ole Miss, having them jump up to the 16 spot. Very impressive win over Tulane. The offense looked a little slow to start the game. They were down, but that double-digit second half comeback, they outscored Tulane 27-3 in the second half. Judkins was locked up for most of the game, but Jackson Dart was able to spread the offense around, and a big win for them, especially over a Tulane team that I wouldn't be surprised if that's their only loss this season. They looked very good overall. And I think they could definitely, a lot of people are talking about them contending for a New Year's Six Bowl, and they could definitely go up there. Especially with only 1 loss by the end of the season. Tulane's not on my rankings right now, but I expect them to come back. And especially by the end of the year, if they end up with maybe 11-1 record, they'll definitely be high on these rankings. They were a good team overall. But talking about Ole Miss, Jackson Dart did great, and the team overall, they got through the struggles and they got a good win.
Yeah, I completely agree. We were both pretty big fans of Tulane these last couple weeks, and they were a ranked team for us both, and deservingly. I think we could even argue them. They're probably in my 26th spot right now if we were going to have one. But Ole Miss looked great. Jackson Dart and Dayton Wade, they were connected all game. It resulted in good drive after good drive, and they just looked fresh out there. Kai Horton, he wasn't at his best for Tulane, but I think that's more credit to the Ole Miss defense, who was in his face, it felt like, the whole entire game. I think the Rebels could make some serious noise going forward. Again, like most teams we mentioned in this top 25, they're going to have some tough parts of their schedule. But Ole Miss and Tulane both impressed me that game. Somebody had to win, and Ole Miss just got the better of the Green Wave. Really like that game. I think it says a lot about the season, and I will be on your side for this one. I think Tulane will definitely be fighting for New Year's Six Bowl. Excuse me. Going to be a good team.
Another team kind of in the same area. They haven't really moved up that much for me. I have Kansas State at 15. Will Howard with 250 yards, 3 touchdowns. Phillip Brooks, 94 yards and a touchdown overall. They beat up on a Troy team that isn't that great overall. So I don't have them really moving at all, which isn't a bad spot for them at 15 now.
Yeah, and at 15, I have Utah. They were on upset watch for a lot of this game, obviously pulled it out in the end, but really worried about the passing game with Cam Rising out. It sounds like he could be back as early as next week, which would obviously be great for the team. But if his injury kind of lingers on later into the season, whether he's on the field or not, they don't have a good option besides him. So I worry about Utah a little bit. They got bumped down a spot or 2 in my rankings, but 15 still solid.
14, I have Oregon. I'm a little lower on them than you are, but Bo Nix had a good game, especially during the start, 360 yards and 2 touchdowns. But the defense is really what kept them in this game. This was a close game throughout the whole entire way, 31-30 towards the end, but then the defense gets that pick 6 to seal it. They had 3 interceptions on the day. And like I said, Bo Nix was good, but overall, they essentially struggled until the last quarter. They put up 20 points in the fourth quarter to win the game overall. But the defense with 3 picks is really what kept them in this game against a Texas Tech team who I had ranked originally, but now they're 0-2 up to this point. But still a competitive game, and I'm not going to knock them at this point. I just don't think they're as good as some of the other teams up there.
Yeah. And at 14, I have LSU just a little bit lower than you do. Jaden Daniels obviously had a great game, gets to boost his stats against Grambling State, who really stood no chance. But I'm kind of looking forward more to the Mississippi State game, which I think will convince me a little more one way or the other. I don't have a lot of movement for LSU right now, but they didn't swing me one way or the other with this last game.
Next up, 13, I have Utah, who you talked about a little bit before. They skidded away that win over Baylor. A great game from Jackson on the ground. They had 130 yards rushing from him. It just wasn't really that impressive to me, a win over Baylor, but I still got to keep them up there. They didn't lose, so Even with the teams that I just talked about too, Oregon kind of barely getting by. They're still a good team overall, just not the best performance.
Yeah, and at 13, I have Kansas State, who I actually like quite a bit. I think they're a pretty good squad. They threw the ball really well against Troy, and maybe I see Troy a little bit differently, but they're a team that I feel like App State, usually plays up really well to the competition. I think Troy is a good squad, but Kansas State handled business pretty easily. Brooks and Jackson both got receiving touchdowns. They played great. And Will Lee on the defensive side got a pick. He played really good against Troy, and the Troy team just couldn't move down the field. I think that's the story of Kansas State's season. Is if their defense shows up, that Wildcats are going to be really, really good. So I think Kansas State keeps making a push. I don't know. I like them. I think they're a team that, if they continue to play well, could potentially be touching my top 10 in the upcoming weeks. But 13's where they're at now. I thought that game against Troy was actually really solid.
Yeah. Next up, I have LSU. I've just been a little higher on them this season. And like I said last week, going into this week, even after that loss, they're going to come back, and that offense, even though they're going against Grambling, they beat them by 62 points. And going into that game, Jaden Daniels, 5 touchdowns. The offense put up 72 points. Malik Nabers making his way back. He had 70 yards and a touchdown. They had 3 rushing touchdowns. And this team is going to make its way back into the top 10, especially soon. I mean, the way that team played, like we keep saying every week, even if you beat a bad team, you're still playing against a football team. And if you beat them by 62 points, that is still impressive overall. And Jaden Daniels is keeping his name up there in the Heisman rankings. This is still a good team.
Yeah, for sure. 12, I have Oregon. Oregon obviously was scaring a lot of fans in that Texas Tech game, but that fourth quarter really solidified it for me. They outscored Texas Tech 20-3. And as you mentioned earlier, Texas Tech was also a team I had ranked my top 25 earlier in the season. I think they're really solid. So if I was a Ducks fan, I wouldn't be too worried. That's a good team you just had to play against and you came out on top. So I think 12 is a fair spot for Oregon. If they continue this momentum, especially the one that they have on offense, their defense is playing well. I completely agree with your point. But this Ducks team really reaches their ceiling if Bo Nix is at his best. And so far, we've been seeing really good performances from him. So I got the Ducks at 12 for this week.
Next up, 11, Alabama, the biggest game going into this week. As you guys have probably seen our predictions from last week, I know you had Alabama by 2 touchdowns. I had Alabama at 6 last week. I wasn't that high on them overall. There was a lot of questions. And going into this game, I mean, Jalen Milroe, he had 2 picks, and they just didn't run the ball at all. They didn't even try to establish the rushing game. Jalen Milroe was tied for the most rushing yards on the team. They just didn't want to at all. And they just didn't look that great. I mean, Milroe was good in a lot of spots. And starting off the game, he's good when he rushes. When he's stuck in the pocket, sometimes he makes those bad decisions, and that's where the 2 interceptions came. But I was very high on Texas going into the season. I'll talk about them a little later when we get to that point. And I think Texas was just a better team that night. And I kind of expected this going into the game. And overall, I mean, like I said, I'll talk about Texas a little later, but great performance from Texas. And Alabama, I mean, they still have a chance this season, but they're going to be competing with Tennessee in the West. So that'll be a good battle between those 2 teams, and even LSU too. I mean, I have Tennessee, Alabama, LSU at 10 through 12. So that'll be very interesting in the West to see who goes on to that SEC championship game. But there's a lot of questions that they have to answer.
Yeah, for sure. And I have to bite my tongue a little bit here. I expected a lot more from Alabama, but it's just a really disappointing loss for them. I mean, you included my prediction of 2 touchdowns. That's how I saw the game going. But going up against Texas, that just wasn't going to be the case. As you mentioned, they have no run game, and Milroe really didn't look that good. I think Milroe was under pressure over and over again, and the Texas defense looked really sharp and forced Alabama into 3rd and long over, like, throughout the whole game, it felt like. And Alabama is a really good squad, don't get me wrong, but if they're going to be playing on 3rd and long, what feels like the whole game, you're not going to get anywhere from that, especially with a team that I expected to run the ball a lot more than they did. They really didn't ever get the running game going, and that forced Milroe to be the primary ball handler on 3rd and long, and it's just not going to work. Texas defense really great. Quinn Ewers really great, but we'll talk about them more later. They're obviously higher on both of our lists. Just Alabama didn't show up, and, that makes me 0-1 in my prediction so far, so we'll see how we go.
Next up, I have Tennessee at the 10 spot, and they're staying in the same spot for me. Joe Milton, overall, he didn't have a terrible game. He just didn't really impress me too much against a team where I thought they should have won by a good amount more than they did. They were struggling in the first half. I mean, after the first quarter, it was tied 3-3. They started to pick it up a little bit in the second half. And the most that I was impressed by was the running back duo between Jabari Small and Jalen Wright. I mean, both of those guys combining for 200 yards overall was great for them. I mean, obviously they'll have a bounce back game after this. They didn't lose, but I think the offense still has some things to work out. And that's fine when you have a guy like Joe Milton out there. I mean, he wasn't going into this season expecting to be perfect in every game, but I can't have them moving up at this point after a win like that. But they do have to start figuring things out once they start getting into these bigger games.
Yeah, number 10, I have Notre Dame. Sam Hartman still looks great, and Steve May was awesome in the run game. And they just did what they had to do against NC State. There's no movement for me here. I had them at 10 last week. They just haven't played a ton of competition. It's not their fault. It's just how the schedule goes. Obviously, a big game against Ohio State coming up. So for now, they're pretty locked into that 10 spot for me unless they do something really good or really bad.
Yeah. And next up, I have Notre Dame in the 9 spot. They did jump 2 spots for me. They jump over Tennessee. I was just more impressed by them than Tennessee. I mean, NC State seems like they're always competitive every year, whether the team is good or not. They come out there swinging. And before this rain delay, it was a close game, but then Notre Dame goes out there after that. Sam Hartman continues to play well on the ground, though. I mean, 130 yards and 2 touchdowns rushing. Overall, this team had 170 yards rushing, and Holden Stays, the tight end, is looking for a good big season this year, obviously replacing Michael Mayer, who got drafted this year. But that's going to be a good target for Sam Hartman down there. The defense, though, played amazing. 3 interceptions, and overall, just a lot of good tackles in the backfield. And they just impressed me a little more than Tennessee this week. That's why I have them jumping up into the 9 spot.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I'm going to have Tennessee in the 9 spot. And I think Notre Dame was a little more impressive, but Tennessee picked it up in the second half. The first half was definitely nerve-wracking. They just looked sluggish in that first half, but they still end up with a decent score. Nothing was particularly bad, but it's just not as explosive as you expect a Vols team to be. Their whole offense is, as I've mentioned in the past, really spread out, kind of gimmicky. And with a guy like Joe Milton, who throws a lot of zip on his passes, you expect big play after big play. And that's just not what Austin Peay left open. They left the short routes open. The slants were working well. Outs were working well. And I think it's just a communication error between Joe Milton and the receivers. We saw a lot of drops that's unlike guys like Squirrel White specifically. And Joe Milton, I think he just zips a little bit too far on the ball. He throws these short passes really hard. And that's something that we saw early in the season that was an issue for Hendon Hooker last year. I think it's a communication thing, and I think in the future, the Vols team will work it out pretty well. But I have Washington jumping on this week, who I'll talk about next, and they just don't look like a better team than Washington, in my opinion. But they'll come out, especially with Alabama taking a big loss. It's going to be a lot of momentum when they match up and go into that game. We'll see how it works, but I still like Tennessee a little more than the team like the Fighting Irish.
Next up, we both have Washington, like you mentioned, in the 8 spot. Michael Penix, 400 yards and 3 touchdowns, continuing that push for the Heisman. Jalen McMillan and overall, the wide receiver core just played amazing. I mean, you have to when you have 400 yards from your quarterback. He spread the offense out very well. And overall, this Washington team, like you said, I also have them moving up over Tennessee. And I think they're a very good team this season. And I've been high on them just because of the play of Michael Penix. And they're going to continue to just keep running up the score on teams with this dynamic offense. And they're a very fun, underrated team right now. Obviously, we both have them in the 8th spot, and the AP does too, but it just seems like they're not really getting talked about as much. I mean, next up, they have a game against Michigan State and Cal and Arizona. Those aren't going to be that massive games. They should be able to come out with those. But towards the end, I mean, their last 4 games of the season, USC, Utah, Oregon State, and Washington State, who are all ranked right now. So it'll definitely be tough once we get towards the end of the season, but they are a good team.
Yeah, I think I might be frozen up a little bit here, but I have similar feelings for Washington, similar notes. Penix is just nothing short of a Heisman candidate, and he showed off against Tulsa. Uh, I mean, they love to spread the ball. The offense is going to get a whole lot of points up. It's just when they match up against tougher teams, is the defense going to hold up like they have been so far? Someone to look out for, but I really like this Husky squad. I think they're really good.
Next up, Penn State. We both have them ranked at 7 to this point. The rushing game going in against Delaware was going to be the big thing that I was looking out for, just because the week before they didn't really get as much done in the running game. But Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, 4 touchdowns between both of them. Drew Aller with a near perfect game. It was against Delaware, but still a massive victory to win by almost 60 points. And that's going to continue to help them, especially going into next week against Illinois, which isn't the best team overall, but it is a Big Ten matchup in Illinois. And depending on the weather, I wouldn't be surprised if it's raining at that point. So Big Ten matchups are always big. Even, I mean, any in conference matchup is big, but they're continuing to build up.
Yeah, for sure. And what I've been looking out for this Penn State team is the running back splits. Obviously, Katron Allen's getting a lot of work. I think we both might agree to say Nick Singleton might be a little bit better at this point. So it's been interesting for me to see how the carries are split. They're getting like even workloads right now. When they go up against higher competition and different style of defenses, I'm waiting to see if Singleton gets more of a workload. That's just a personal thing, though. I think that Illinois game is going to be really good for him, as well as Iowa. Obviously, Iowa's a team that's not ranked by the AP, but they're ranked by me. I think that's going to be a really good matchup. And that's just the definition of a gritty sort of game. I think both of those teams are going to try to run the ball at each other. Good defense will be played. But yeah, Penn State, they're definitely not on the downturn for me. I think they're looking better as each week passes. And if they go out and are convincing against Illinois and Iowa, those Big Ten matchups, then they have space to move up for me. I think this Penn State team has a really high ceiling, even more than some of the other teams that we've talked about in the similar area of our ranking. So I think they're going to show out and hopefully just keep the ball rolling. I think they're looking really good so far.
Yeah. Next up, USC in the 6th spot. I did drop them 1 spot. They didn't lose or anything. That doesn't mean that they got worse, but a team that I have above them is Texas. Obviously, after that win, just a little more impressive. But I mean, looking at the stats, Caleb Williams had more touchdowns than he had incompletions, and he's just playing amazing. I mean, when you look at these stats, especially against a team like Stanford, he's not going to go out there and throw 500 yards and 5 touchdowns just because he's going to get pulled out. Miller Moss went in there and had nearly the same amount of completions and attempts as Caleb Williams did, just because obviously they're pulling out the offense at that point. But they had most of their points. I mean, they had close to 50 points at halftime. And overall, the running game looked good. 4 touchdowns from the running backs. The offense overall, between Brendan Rice, Taj Washington, Deuce Robinson, all had 70 yards. So it's good to see that spread around. And this team is still very good, even though they dropped a spot. It's just because I was more impressed by Texas, but they're still definitely up there with Caleb Williams.
Yeah. And at 6, I have a team I'm a little lower on than most people. I have Florida State here. I think I'm really just a little bit lower than most people because I'm also a little bit lower on LSU in general. So obviously it was a huge win, but it just doesn't stand out to me the same way that it does for some other people. Not saying Florida State's a bad team at all. Obviously it handled business last week, and Jordan Travis continues to look really, really good. So if Florida State keeps moving at the level that they're at right now, it's going to be a playoff team, no doubt. But I just don't necessarily see the ceiling that other people do. Like, for example, I think Penn State might even have a higher ceiling than Florida State, in my opinion. I know it's a hot take, but it's just how I see the squad moving. Florida State's going to have some really tough games. I'm looking forward on their schedule. I don't think that Clemson game is going to be particularly easy. Obviously, you have them ranked. A lot of people don't, but they're fighting for that bottom spot for me. So Florida State Seminoles look really good. I understand you're going to talk a little bit more about them. You have them in the 4, but for me, I think 6 is about where they're at.
Next up, Texas, the biggest team going into this week, especially against Alabama. I have them at the 5 spot now. I did move them up 3 spots. I didn't move them up as high just because I wasn't as high on Alabama And I was very high on LSU going into the season. Like basically what you said, just the opposite wise, I have Florida State above them just because I thought that was a little bit more of an impressive win just because I had more potential on LSU. But Texas, I mean, if there is a year, like I said before, I usually don't buy into the Texas hype, but this is the year. Quinn Ewers, 350 yards and 3 touchdowns. A.D. Mitchell, a big transfer coming over from Georgia. I had big expectations for him this season, 2 touchdowns. Xavier Worthy, 75 yards and a touchdown. Tavion Sanders, the big tight end, 115 yards. Highlighting this game last week, if they're going to beat Alabama, that big 3 with Quinn Ewers, that is going to be massive for them. And obviously Jalen Milroe with the 2 interceptions and the Texas defense just putting pressure on them overall. But the key to this Texas offense is they're going to be able to outduel pretty much any team. So it's just going to come down to the mistakes. And if they can capitalize on those mistakes like the defense did, getting those 2 interceptions, you want to give this offense as many opportunities as possible because they're electric with Quinn Ewers, A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, and Jatavion Sanders. And this team has a very high ceiling this season. I mean, with this offense being as good as it is, they have the ceiling to go all the way. Obviously, they're going to have some tough games, so we'll just see what happens with those games. And if they continue to play well, they'll definitely be in the playoffs. I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. And I do have them behind Florida State right now. Like I said, with the LSU, I was just a little more impressed by that win. But I still think Texas, that was a massive win for them, especially at the beginning of the season.
Yeah, for sure. Next up, I have USC at 5. I don't have any movement for them right now. They're just a really good team doing everything that they have to do. And it's going to be hard for me to move them down with that in mind. Obviously, if a team gets a really impressive win, they could get bumped down, just by the nature of those things happening. But honestly, this USC team could be fighting for the best team in the country. I think they're right up there. And that Colorado matchup coming up on the 30th, it's just looking more and more exciting every day. It's early, so we'll see how I feel when the game time comes around. Obviously, I think USC is a bit of a better team, so they should come out on top of that. But we'll see how it goes. I really like USC. I think everyone likes Caleb Williams at this point. Everyone knows that he's just this top tier level talent. I think the Trojans are in for a big year. And as you mentioned, with pretty much all of these teams we have at the top, really wouldn't be surprised if they have a good playoff spot. I'm talking like 1 or 2 as we go forward, but a lot of season left before we come to determinations or predictions like that.
Next up, Florida State in the 4 spot. No movement for me within my top 4. Jordan Travis wasn't the most impressive this week. 15 for 29, 175 yards and 2 touchdowns. So only completing about half of his passes. But Trey Benson, 80 yards and 3 touchdowns. Very impressive on the ground for him. They beat up on South Miss. Just overall, not very much movement for them. Still looked good overall. Just I would have expected a little more from Travis against a team not that great.
Yeah, and at 4, this is where I have Texas, which is funny because I've been a lot lower on Texas than you have. But that win against Alabama was really big for me. Obviously, I liked Alabama quite a bit, and Texas just kind of shut it down, made it look easy. Obviously, Quinn Ewers has a great game. He's finding his targets all over the field. Jatavion Sanders is really, really good. He had a couple drops early, but just absolutely incredible at his position. And then talking about Mitchell and Worthy, I mean, they're fighting to be the best wide receiver duo in the country. I know people will argue that Ohio State has a better one, but I kind of like Mitchell and Worthy, especially after that last game. They just looked great. The defense came out firing. And if you're in a big game like you are when you travel to Tuscaloosa and play Alabama, it's going to be big to be on top of the turnover battle. And those 2 interceptions came I would say probably 2 of the biggest moments of the game. So that was absolutely huge. It shifted the tide. And I think they just looked great out there. Texas is, if the season ended today, I think they would be deserving of a playoff spot. So liked what the Longhorns did. I think 4 might be a little high. We'll see how USC does. We'll see how a team like Penn State does, even Tennessee. These are squads that could jump them going forward. But after a big win like that, I want to give credit where it's due. I have Texas in my 4 spot.
Next up, Michigan. I still have them at 3. Win over UNLV. JJ McCarthy, very good game from him. Close to 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. But Blake Corum, 3 touchdowns on the ground, 80 yards. He just looked unstoppable. He's one of the best, if not the best running back in the country right now. And I still continue to have Michigan at this 3 spot. Just a good game from the offense overall.
Yeah, I have Michigan here too. They looked really efficient. They weren't super high powered, but they didn't have to be. Uh, I mean, their schedule looks easier than usual this year. So those last 3 weeks are obviously going to tell the story of their season. They take on Penn State, they have Maryland, and then they take on Ohio State at home. So it's going to be a big end to their season here. But unless all goes wrong, I don't see Michigan really slipping from this top 3 spot that I have them in.
And Ohio State also winning their game 35-7. Kyle McCord looked good, 3 touchdowns, 260 yards. Trayvon Henderson had 2 touchdowns, and Marvin Harrison in that first half looked unstoppable, 160 yards and 2 touchdowns. A lot of people kind of questioning where he was in week 1. He came out and proved that he's the best wide receiver in college football right now. And coming out to even Emeka Egbuka had close to 100 yards and a touchdown. So both of these guys, especially after a quiet week 1, come back. And I still have Ohio State above Michigan at this point just because of that. Michigan does have that good running game. And I mean, JJ McCarthy has been impressive. I really like Roman Wilson. Cornelius Johnson, I think, is good. But I do think that Ohio State, especially when it comes to that passing game, is a little better. And when we're comparing those two teams, it's going to be a pass heavy game. It just always is, especially with those two quarterbacks. But I still have Ohio State up there at 2.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where we disagree for most people ranking, but we agree with each other. I have Ohio State at 2 as well. I think they look equally as impressive as Michigan, which is, why that last game is going to be so fun. But I think their biggest test is going to be that Notre Dame game just because it comes early. Whoever ends up on top of that is obviously going to take a pretty good jump in our rankings. I know Ohio State doesn't have a lot of room to work, but if they get a win like that, it's going to be really impressive for their resume. So I just like what they're doing over there. Really don't have too much to say. I think we're kind of in a waiting game for both of these teams, Michigan and Ohio State, until we get to bigger parts of their schedule. But I think the Buckeyes are doing everything right so far. I think McCord is the real deal. I think he's going to be their starting quarterback for the long haul. So good for Ohio State. Still going to stay in my 2 spot for the upcoming future.
And Georgia still in the 1 spot, beating up on Ball State overall. I mean, getting 24 different receptions between a lot of these receivers. Dominic Lovett was the highest. He had the most receptions between any of the receivers with 4. So it's definitely spreading out that offense. Like I said, especially at the start of the season, that's what you like to see. You want to see these different receivers get into the offense. And sometimes, obviously, that doesn't come up on the stat sheet as much. These guys don't have massive games when you spread it out. But Carson Beck with 30 overall attempts, it was good to see that ball definitely moving around a lot. The rushing attack was good too. 3 total touchdowns between the running backs, and the team looked good overall. Carson Beck with his first mistake of the year with that interception, but that's really it. If we're nitpicking for things overall, I mean, that's really all you can say, especially with a punt return touchdown. The team just looked great overall with 3 interceptions too on top of that.
Oh, yeah. And I'm not going to have many notes for Georgia that you haven't mentioned. For now, it's just the Bulldogs versus the world. It would be kind of foolish to rank anyone above Georgia right now, just based on the talent that they have on the roster and the past couple seasons, how great the coaching has been. Obviously, the culture shift with Kirby Smart is a huge storyline in Georgia Bulldogs college football history. It's obviously just the prime time to be a fan of the Bulldogs. They look great. I don't think they're going to be touched anytime soon. And Carson Beck just needs to keep doing what he's doing right now. I think there was a little bit of quarterback controversy in the offseason. Obviously, some people weren't fully on board with Carson Beck after Stetson Bennett had been so good for the Bulldogs. So as long as he just keeps playing well, I'm not worried about the interception. He keeps the QB spot under wraps, which I think is going to happen. Georgia's looking good for the foreseeable future. So not too worried about what's going on in Athens right now. I think the Bulldogs are going to be both far number 1s until something goes really wrong.
Yeah. And going into next week, really no massive games, no double AP ranked games up to this point. Some teams that I'm a little higher on, maybe not ranked, but there could be some potential upsets. But a lot of these spreads overall, if you look through them, a lot of games that probably aren't going to be that close. One game potentially to look at, that Mizzou Kansas State game. Mizzou comes out every year and they fight, especially at home. So That could be a potential upset alert game just because Mizzou is just always solid, especially this season. But besides that, I mean, a lot of games where we're just seeing if the offenses can start to click a little bit more. So with that being said, we'll see you guys next week for our rankings. Maybe not that much of movement, but we'll get a little more questions answered by then.
Yeah, for sure. See you guys next week.